Hey folks, thanks for joining us today. We certainly do appreciate it. On the line, two of our most favorite people in the world, Andy Hoffman from Miles Franklin and Jeff Nielson from Bullion Bulls Canada. Gentlemen.
Hey guys.
Hey Jeff, pleasure to meet you.
Likewise.
And hello to all of you.
And Rory and Peter as well from SGT Report. Guys, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so with so much to talk about on planet Earth, where does one even begin? I want to lob a softball in the direction of our friend Andy, who is probably fit to be tied about the 10-year Treasury note being, 2.95. Andy, what will this mean, these rising interest rates? What will this mean for the money masters in their Ponzi scheme?
Remember last month when we went into the NFP report, I said we would get a, quote, worse than expected number because the 10-year note had risen to a whopping 2.75%. Well, here we are a month later, and the same thing had to happen because we closed on Thursday at 2.995%. So it was a 100% guarantee that all their statistical alterations would create a, quote, worse than expected number. But on top of that, the number was so bad, meaning they changed last month's number by 36%, and the internals as usual, the all-time high, all-time low labor participation rate. It makes it to the point where no one is going to even, I think pretty soon no one's going to even pay attention to the NFP payroll report. It's become so comical. But either way, the fact is that the 10-year note is sitting at 2.95% after yesterday's activity, which means it's doubled from where it was in May, which is why the housing market is already rolling over. And when you look at real economic data, not these stupid diffusion indexes they put out whenever they want to change people's perceptions, like retail sales, durable goods, you name it across the board, the real data is bad. So the Fed is now going to be stuck in the position at their FOMC meeting of deciding to either taper and shoot themselves in the head, given that they've purchased more than 100% of all the issuance this year, while the Chinese and Japanese are now selling, or continue with QE and cause a potential run on the dollar.
Jeff, let me ask you this. We hear that rising interest rates are bad for precious metals. But in my opinion, maybe in yours and Jeff's as well, this time that's probably not true. Can you explain why?
Well, it's probably going to be almost a bit like having clones here with me and Andy because, we sort of see these things the same way. And, one of the reasons that I've spent the last 4+ years laughing every time Ben Bernanke and the corporate media start talking exit strategy, quote unquote, it's because obviously the U.S. government can't afford it. And, what do we see here with the last 6 months of comedy? Simply talking about beginning an exit strategy has caused U.S. interest rates on 10-year treasuries to nearly double. You filter this through the economy. Like, of course, the direct cost of this interest rates alone are probably still only about $10 billion a month for the U.S. government. But when you filter this through an economy which is mired with, I think, close to $700 trillion in debt in one form or another, then this seemingly minor increase in treasury rates to the ordinary person translates into a sucking out of capital from the U.S. economy at least as large in size as the entire stimulus package in 2009. So it's something that obviously must, detonate this flimsy economy. And so I've never taken it seriously, of course, unless they want to detonate the economy.
They had to say something earlier this year. There was so much pressure on Helicopter Ben as he comes to the end of his chairmanship and his legacy starts to get written, to do something, to say something that's not about printing money, which is all he's ever done since he's got into office. The problem is, as you said, the entire economy, the entire global economy is dependent on it. In fact, my piece from Thursday or from Friday was called Irreversible Global Debt Addiction, and it shows how the entire world, in fact, the corporations in Asia are far more leveraged in general than the ones in the West. So it's the entire world. If you look at this chart, this great chart that came out from Incrementum the other day, if you total up all the debt of the corporations, the individuals, the municipalities, sovereigns, Japan is at 500% of GDP. So is the UK. Just about all of Europe is in 300 or 400% range, as is the United States. And that doesn't even include all the derivatives that are off balance sheet. Heck, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have $5 trillion of debt which are not included in the national debt in those calculations. So the fact is, each 1% increase alone causes catastrophic increases in interest payments across the economy. Just the national debt, just the 17 trillion they tell you about, each 1% is $170 billion a year. So we just went up, 200 plus billion in our annual deficit. And can you imagine if the 10-year note goes to 5 or 6%? That would add like 400 or 500 billion to our annual deficit.
Yeah, it's insurmountable debt, and it will crush this unconstitutional government, this administration that does not want to be tied down by the bounds of the Constitution. It's going to collapse under its own weight. Andy, you wrote in that article, Irreversible Global Debt Addiction, I quote, "Joe Sixpack is too busy struggling for survival to care about the esoteric world of economics. They are so ingrained in the environment of monetary printing, manipulation, and propaganda that they've lost all sense of reality." Now, people in this country are going to wake up when we see something like this headline happen to them. This is from Zero Hedge. Poland confiscates half of private pension funds to cut sovereign debt load. I mean, this is insane, guys. Now it's happening all over Europe. They're just going to seize the pension funds.
Well, it was one of the most easiest things in the world to predict. And so, I've been writing about this before. A year ago, I came out with a commentary how your bank account could disappear. It's real simple. The financial institutions are leveraged to the hilt with debt. Our governments are leveraged to the hilt with debt and teetering on bankruptcy, and the treasuries are empty. So when the stealing takes place, where is it going to come from? It's going to be targeted theft of private assets, these bank accounts, those pension funds, and so on and so on. There was nothing else to steal, so obviously this is what the thieves were going to start stealing next.
Yeah, well, as we all know, this is happening all over the world. It happened in Hungary, in Argentina, now Poland. They're talking about Ireland, and and Cyprus, of course, and all different places. That they're talking about it. Remember, it was only, I'm looking for the article, I haven't found it yet, about 3 or 4 months ago, where the United States apparently has one of its million bureaus called the Consumer Financial Protection Board, which I had never heard of, and they are now talking about, quote, managing people's pension funds. Like, you will give it to them and they will manage it for you, which sounds to me like the exact same thing. And of course, all these things were talked about, if you remember, in 2008, 2009. They were debating in Congress the, what did they call those things? Those annuities where you'd get treasury bonds, and I forgot what the name of them is, and you'd get a return tied to treasury bonds and they'd hold your money forever. So these things are all being talked about right now, and all it takes is one big drop in the markets to get Congress to talk about these on the front burner again. Eventually they'll do it here because they need every penny they can get.
Yeah, before I turn it over to Rory for a question about the rupee, which I know you'll love, Andy, I wanted to follow up on that Zero Hedge headline about Poland confiscating half of private pension funds. We talked about this on our latest episode of Doomer News, but I'm going to just throw it out there in case anybody wants to weigh in, otherwise we'll move on. I don't know if you guys recall, but in 2010, a plane carrying Polish President Lech Kaczynski, his top military and state leadership, 96 people in all, went down. It crashed. The official story is all aboard perished. There is video evidence that official story is not true. There was not 96 people aboard that plane. In fact, some of the survivors were shot by a black ops team on the ground that day. And you can Google this video. I'm not making it up. Posted it when it happened. Google the video, search for the video called Polish Plane Crash Digitally Enhanced, Proof Humanity is at War with the Banksters. Now, who was Kaczynski opposed to? He was opposed to the Rothschild banking cartel and against Poland adopting the euro. Yep. Now, conveniently, he no longer is in charge. There's new leadership. And the government has just announced a plan to confiscate half of private pension funds. When I say, and have been saying for years now, that humanity is at war with the banksters, they have declared war on the people of the world.
Well, indeed. And you mentioned the phrase, the money masters. For any of your audience that haven't watched that fabulous documentary, it's something that is simply a must-see for everybody. It's the real history. It's the phony stuff in our fictional history books with all the stuff that's been omitted, added back in to connect the dots. And what we clearly see over and over again, especially in the U.S., is anybody who stands up and says we need to smash the banks is murdered.
It's like Bill Hicks always said. Why do the good people die and then the demons live forever, All right, so let's move on to the rupee, which I know is right up Andy's alley. Rory, I know you had a specific question for Andy about the rupee.
Yes, I do, and thank you very much. Andy, I know you're a big fan of the rupee and India in general.
Yeah.
And I was reading a story yesterday that we posted over at SGT Report about the Indian farmers shun volatile gold and buy land instead. And how is this going to help the rupee at all, or do anything to help the government to curtail the Indians' love of gold? I mean, they're trying anything. I mean, I'd actually ask a question: is this a propaganda piece? I mean, because it just seems completely ridiculous.
One, it's a propaganda piece because this Indian government, and not just the Indian government, we now have, as we call it, the Fragile Five, which I wrote about the other day, which would be the currencies of India, Indonesia, Turkey, Brazil, and someone can get me with the other one. Sorry. But the point is, all these currencies are crashing, and more than a quarter of the world's population lives in these countries, so they're seeing inflation everywhere. But India, of course, is the biggest of all of them. And I liken the situation in India, I have for a long time, to apartheid in South Africa. I mean, the entire nation of India thinks of precious metals and real items of value as their net worth. If you ask the average Indian, what's your net worth, he's not going to say, oh, 1 million rupees. They talk about the gold and silver and the actual things they own. So what they've basically done is they've joined the fiat currency system, this tiny group of bureaucrats in the government, and crashed the financial system into hell. They have some of the world's worst food inflation. Well, in fact, it's right up there with Egypt. So that's why I expect we're going to see some civil unrest there soon, because prices have gone up so much. And as for this article, shun follow this guy in Bloomberg or whatever knows what all the Indian farmers are doing. How much land is there? And by the way, farmers buy land. The last time I looked, that was something they did for a living. It doesn't mean that they're saying, oh, we're not going to buy gold. I mean, that's just ridiculous. People in India are smuggling gold into the country in record amounts, and the more they try these ridiculous draconian things like, did you see the other day that the Indian government is now talking about going to the Hindu temples and trying to buy their gold?
Yeah. I saw that.
With rupees? Are you kidding me? It's just going to be a complete disaster in India. It's coming soon, as it is in the Fragile Five and many other places.
Well, here I'll actually differ from Andy's perspective somewhat, because I view this current dynamic somewhat differently. When you talk about these currencies crashing, I see these currencies being attacked. I see what is happening in India as being nothing less than flagrant blackmail. We have the Rothschilds One Bank trying to strong-arm India's government into doing everything possible to limit the amount of gold consumption in that population. And so, when you talk about this current piece about the farming being propaganda, of course, one of the defenses for India's government is simply job owning, saying to the One Bank, saying to the Rothschilds, oh, look, we're doing what you told us. We're getting these people away from gold and into real estate or into a paper called gold. And so, we see all this stuff coming out because, this is, I don't think the Indian government was, intentionally dishonest and corrupt with respect to betraying its own people. I think it's been pushed in this direction by the strong arming of the One Bank.
Well, remember, we're in a global fiat currency system. I'm not saying that I disagree with Jeff at all. I mean, I try to shy away from all that stuff with the Rothschilds, and because it's just not something that I see enough proof of, although others may say so. But the fact is, we are in a world right now where every country really has to do this fiat currency stuff. They are all strong-armed by the Western powers. Can you imagine if India's government can't do it because they don't have any gold anymore, but if they said, yeah, we're going to do a gold standard, it would be no different than Iran or Syria saying we're not going to sell oil for petrodollars. So they really have no choice. But the fact is, particularly in India, which happens to be the nation with the most historically gold-loving population of 1 billion plus people who happen to spend more on food than almost anyone on their planet as a percentage of income, is just ripe for disaster more than any other place on the planet.
Andy, you wrote recently, and I quote, "I could not have imagined how universally destructive the Fed has become or how close we are to the end game." Can you expand upon that a little bit? Help the listeners realize we're very near the end game.
Well, I'm guessing that that came from the article called "The Most Important Article I've Ever Written."
It did.
Yeah, because I came up, I didn't intend to come up with this chart. I just, again, I was looking at the Fragile Five to see how much their currencies had fallen against the dollar, meaning how much inflation has been exported to these nations since the Fed stepped up with Operation Twist and then QE3 and QE4. But then when I did those five and saw how much they went down, I said, well, let me just look at all of the other countries. And as it turns out, the only two countries on earth whose currencies have not fallen against the dollar in the last 2 years, if you could believe this, are the Kenyan shilling and the Ugandan shilling. Those are the only two, and only by tiny percentages, meaning there's been so much destruction, so much inflation created by what the Fed has done, that there's not a single country on earth that hasn't felt it. And sadly, the countries with the biggest populations are feeling it the most. In fact, the day after I wrote a piece about China, which I just recently visited, showing how even with the pegged yuan to the dollar, they too have been experiencing dramatic inflation. And so right now the Fed is painted in a corner. If God forbid they taper, let alone try to stop what they're doing, there'll be no buyers of treasuries, and we'll see the inflation explode here. But if they continue with it, they will literally destroy, and whether these currencies are being attacked or just destroyed from within doesn't matter. The fact is, what we are seeing will get dramatically worse. We are going to see widespread Egypt-like civil unrest across the world, and eventually a loss of confidence in all the currencies.
Well, I think I know how Andy's going to respond to this next one, so I'll throw it over to you, Jeff. Michael Snyder of Economic Collapse blog says, who is going to buy our debt if this war causes China, Russia, and the rest of the world to turn on us? As we see this administration beat the war drums for yet more unconstitutional war, Jeff, do you think they even realize that they're playing with fire? Or do they not care because the Fed owns so much of our debt anyway?
Well, my position for the last several years has been that there are no buyers for U.S. debt, period. You know, we have this incredible sham where immediately after the crash of '08, we have the U.S. Treasury Department changing its procedures for Treasury auctions so that suddenly and for the first time in history, nobody had any idea about who was really buying the Treasuries. So we have the world's largest debt market suddenly become totally opaque overnight in the classic cheap magician act. And then the cheap magician assures us as the lights go out that there are, in fact, people buying U.S. debt. And then the lights come back on and the pile of Treasury disappears. And he goes, look, that proves there are buyers. And, of course, with the Fed fighting off any attempts at a realistic audit, the cheap magician can play this game as long as it wants. And, I mean, I wrote an article 2 years ago, Maximum Fraud in U.S. Treasuries Market. And we had all these treasuries disappearing every time the lights go out, and no possible buyers anywhere on the horizon. There are no sums of capital anywhere in the world that could be dedicated to the buying of U.S. treasuries. Any government that has any paper needs it themselves. So, you know, for several years, there's been no plausible buyers for this paper. And so I simply said, well, you know, there are no realistic buyers. The treasuries are disappearing every time the lights go out. So clearly what the Fed is doing is simply counterfeiting money itself and buying its own treasuries with counterfeited money that's being printed but never, ever declared.
Exactly. Just like the $16 trillion that we found out that the Fed handed out to pretty much everyone in the world in 2008 and 2009. Heck, they even gave some to McDonald's and Toyota. We still don't even know if they repaid it, but according to the Fed, that was not money printed. I mean, I remember back, I'm guessing 2006, 7, 2005, way before even everything fell apart, when all of a sudden, within the big buyers of treasuries, two parties came in. One, something called the Caribbean Banking Centers, suddenly showed up out of the blue and became massive buyers of treasuries. Who are the Caribbean Banking Centers? Well, of course, they're the offshore shells of the United States government and whoever their cronies are that they're giving money to. And then the other one, which was even more comical, was the UK. All of a sudden, the UK became a huge buyer. They're the most indebted, collapsing piece of crap country on earth. But all of a sudden, they have trillions of dollars to buy U.S. treasuries with. So, yeah, I agree with Jeff. I think that the, quote, the bull market in treasuries, which theoretically has gone up until, you know, let's say April, it really ended probably 5 or 6 years ago in a free market perspective, when the U.S. had to start monetizing. And the fact is, even with all this fake money that we're not even hearing about, the fact is they have admitted to buying more than the Treasury issuance this year and almost as much last year. So, of course, there's no one buying. Look at last month. Sorry, not last month, June. We don't have July numbers yet. In June, Japan and China sold, I think it was 40 or 60 billion dollars of treasuries. I mean, the two of them combined owned over 2 trillion. And back in 2008, they only owned like 700 billion. They alone either, have been funded by the U.S. government or have been stupid enough to try to support the treasuries and keep the game going. But the fact is now they're selling. There's no one left.
With China, the dynamic is different. They stopped buying directly from the U.S. government about 3 years ago. The fact that they've been maintaining their holdings and even inching them higher is because they've been absorbing these treasuries from other governments as part of their currency swaps and bilateral trade agreements. This is the draining the swamp operation, where they're purging all of this bad paper off of the balance sheets of these other governments, taking it on themselves, because, of course, it concentrates this in their hands and gives them a much bigger club to wield against the U.S. government to protect themselves from the same sort of attacks that other governments are facing. At the same time, it facilitates these bilateral currency agreements where they phase the dollar out as reserve currency and move the renminbi in to replace it. Get rid of the treasuries, drain the swamp, move to reserve currency. It's a very beautiful process.
Yeah, and the handful, if you go back to May when the 10-year note, for instance, was down to 1.5%, the handful of people in the Communist Party were patting themselves on the back, thinking, "Wow, we're such geniuses. We've just been printing money and buying all their treasuries. Look at how much money we've made." I mean, it's incredible how much money the Fed and the Chinese and Japanese governments have lost just in the last 4 months. The Fed alone, I think we did the math here, was something like they've already lost $200 or $300 billion of capital. So when people say, well, they now own $2 trillion of treasuries and they have a $3.5 trillion balance sheet, I'm going, isn't anyone doing the math about the money that they're losing? They keep just like even the Fed, the St. Louis Fed has that chart of the treasury holdings going up, and I'm going, no, they're not. That number should be plummeting now because they're losing so much money as the treasuries plummet. And the Fed has barely any capital to start with. So at some point, the Fed itself is going to be called into question for its solvency because it could print all it wants. But as interest rates go up and their bond portfolio goes down, they literally, become bankrupt. And remember, because of this brilliance of Operation Twist, and since with QE3 and QE4, they now have gone way out on the yield curve buying all these long-dated maturities. I think their average is now over 10 years. So they are losing at a much faster rate than they would have in the past.
I want to jump in, and I need you guys to help me flush this out. What we've painted here is a very bleak picture based on real news and real information. And here's where it gets scary, right? When we talk about the Federal Reserve losing confidence and control over the markets, when we talk about the international debt situation and the paper Ponzi scheme literally collapsing in on itself, when we talk about these people who are really behind many of the false flag operations we've seen throughout history, Wall Street banks, the CIA, those connected in those circles of power, where it gets really, really scary is, and I want you guys to help me understand if it's possible, can Humpty Dumpty be put back together again? Because I think it's really important for the powers that be, those politicians who might be listening to this, those who might be, attached to these circles of power in any way. It's really important for them to understand that maybe Humpty Dumpty can't be put back together again, because I'm very concerned about another false flag operation that might be used to try to get Syria to stick with the petrodollar, that might be used to rally the American people around yet more war, that might be used to lead us right into World War III in the name of saving this unsavable system. What do you guys think?
Well, I can see, several potential paths. And, much of it depends on, of course, some events that are outside the control of these corrupt governments. But some of it also depends simply on their intent. For instance, one possible scenario is to simply run the system right to the very brink of absolute collapse. And then you stage a debt jubilee event. But, of course, it's not the typical debt jubilee in history where everybody's debts get wiped clean. It's a partial debt jubilee where only the debts of the corporations and the government are wiped clean, and all of the personal debts i.e. the debts of the little people, are maintained at 100 cents on the dollar.
Sounds
so
like TARP to me.
They get a perfect reset of the system, and just simply start their stealing all over again. Except, of course, all of the little people are infinitely poorer, because suddenly the depreciated currency that our governments were using becomes fully reappreciated when they erase their own debts, and thus essentially inflates the magnitude of all the personal debts. So, I mean, that's one possible hell where they maintain control, assuming they could get away with such a crime, and simply reset the system. But I mean, as you point out, the Third World War scenario is a very possible one. But I mean, perhaps even more likely is simply the whole false flag terrorism game. Oh, well, gee, now the terrorists are in our society, so we've got to do this and that and the next thing to, maintain control from the terrorists. Just the repetition of the McCarthy witch hunt of the 50s.
Yeah, and Jeff's first scenario is exactly what happened in 2008. That's what TARP and TALP and all those other things were about, bailing out the very bad guys who created the problems while the rest of the nation got nothing. And as we know, the bankers have gotten much more powerful and risky in the last 5 years, while the rest of the nation is much worse off. Real unemployment is much higher, real wages are much lower, net worth is down, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that's their preferred method, is to keep giving the money themselves and hoping the status quo maintains. Of course, when we get to the next go round of 2008, what I would call Global Meltdown 3, there's going to be no money left in the till to bail out the bankers. In fact, no one will let them do that. There'll be such an outcry against them. So what will happen? I don't know. But when it comes to the whole thing with false flags and everything, I mean, yes, certainly some of these things have to be. They just make no sense otherwise. But I don't think that there's that much planning that goes into it until the last second. My view has always been these guys wake up every day thinking, how do we prevent the collapse from happening today? And they just kind of build on top of, one stupid moronic idea on top of the other until you just sit right here. And then, like any other Ponzi scheme, they need even bigger, stupider ideas to go on, like bail-ins. And eventually, the biggest, stupidest ideas, like let's bomb Syria just to take everyone's minds off of what's going on back at home. And, ultimately something's going to backfire in their face in such a big way that it'll be written in the history books, because I am so terrified of what's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years here, and potentially the next few months for all we know.
Well, I think this is a perfect time to talk about real-world demand for precious metals. Peter, what was your question for Andy specifically? I know you had one.
Yeah, Andy, talking specifically about silver, I'm wondering what you're seeing in the world of 90% so-called junk silver. Not many years ago was possible, not necessarily easy, but you could find junk silver for even under melt value, and it looks like those days are over. From what I'm seeing in my world, 90% silver is drying up and getting just hard to find in any significant quality. And I'm curious, since you're in the business, what's going on your end with junk silver as far as it coming into your business and flowing out from it?
Okay, well, first, let me I'll say the bigger picture of what we're seeing in our business, and then I'll go to quote, junk silver. What we have seen, April was our busiest month ever after the whole alternative currencies violation, whatever you call it. After that, that was by far our busiest month ever. There was so much demand; it was just off the charts, and the premiums surged again. But they fed all these guys. The cartel have been attacking so viciously, and over the summer, of course, which typically is slow anyway, that business has gotten very slow. I mean, it's just starting to turn around now because we're in the fall. But America is only a small part of the bullion world. I mean, the U.S. in general only buys about 5% or 7% of all the gold and silver bought around the world. So that doesn't mean the world's not busy. There's been record demand in India, in China, around the world. That's why premiums are so high. That's why we're in backwardization. That's why we have negative GOFO rates. That's why the Chinese imports from Hong Kong are just off the charts. But I suspect that now that we're in the fall and people are coming back from vacations, we're going to see a lot more buying over here. When it comes to junk silver, it's very, very interesting because, yes, the demand has slowed down just like the rest of the business over the last 2 to 3 months. However, the premiums have largely stuck. And as you say, you used to be able to buy it below melt value or at melt value, which is why it was called junk silver in the first place. But if you try to call us right now, yes, we'll be able to get it, but you're probably going to pay a spot $2 to $4 per ounce, which is an incredible statement given how low demand has been. And of course, as soon as we have the next buying surge, we're going to go right back to where we were in the spring, which was spot $6 plus $7 an ounce, and you couldn't even find the stuff. And again, they haven't made this stuff in 60 years. So there's going to be the big overwhelming buying of junk silver in which there's no more left.
Jeff, I think I'd be remiss not to ask you your thoughts on, or either of you, what you guys are seeing out of central banks and governments around the planet, and whether or not they're acquiring precious metals. I think we know the answer. What are you guys' thoughts on what we're seeing, even as the average American slumbers and maybe hasn't bought any physical precious metal? What are we seeing from governments? What's the lesson to learn from what we're seeing around the world?
Well, it's interesting in the short term. Basically, what we've seen is a slight easing back in central bank purchases, with a couple of exceptions. Russia being a notable exception to the general trend here. And of course, again, this essentially just emphasizes the tightness of the market. We know that, in a perfect world, these central banks would be buying thousands of tons of gold per year, and not just the 600 or so tons they bought last year and were on pace to buy this year. But then we have this global explosion in demand in April as a consequence of the one bank's operations. And then all of a sudden, we see a tapering back in central bank purchases because they don't want to put that much extra pressure on demand at a time when obviously there's extreme tightness in the market.
Right. We haven't seen as many announcements per se. But
announcements,
of course,
exactly.
Yeah, but of course, they don't always tell you what they do. In fact, when we talk about Chinese imports from Hong Kong, that doesn't mean that's all that China is doing. That's not even what the sovereign wealth funds are specifically doing. That is simply saying that's how much gold went from Hong Kong to China. And of course, yes, Russia does talk about what they do, but the others generally don't. For all we know, the Japanese government has been buying and not telling us. And remember, the key is the inventories in the West have been plunging. I mean, the COMEX inventory, whether you believe the data or not, I don't know. Some of that data from the CME is lies. But believe me, if the CME is going to lie about anything, they're not going to lie and tell you that inventories are plunging. Because in April, when they started this big attack on gold, there were 3 million ounces of registered, meaning available to be taken, gold in the COMEX. There's now only 700,000. This is just in 4 months over the summertime, which is slow. So someone is buying that stuff. And of course, if you read the people in Europe, the guys like Egon von Greyers who are talking to the refiners, the Swiss refineries are going full out. They are making kilo bars out of coins to send them out east. And are they going to governments or are they going to the people? I don't know, but they're going somewhere. And, we probably will never be told about it.
Yeah, Rory just posted an interesting chart about China's gold consumption. Rory, did you have that handy to just rattle off those numbers?
I'm looking right at it. It's in August, 116.3 tons went to China from Hong Kong. Annualized, that equals 1,395.6 tons and a 2,400 ton annual market. So the question I ask is, where is all the gold? It's all in China.
That's right.
Well, let me just add an important distinction here when it comes to the issue of national gold reserves, which many of your listeners may not be aware of. There are, of course, two ways for any government to accumulate gold. They can buy it internationally in the open market, or they can accumulate it domestically, presumably from local production. Any gold that is purchased on the open market, it's legally required that it be declared in a timely manner by all governments, just as in all other international currency transfers, because, of course, gold has always been regarded as a currency by the entire international financial community, despite all of the years of nonsense about barbarous relic. Conversely, with respect to any all gold that is added domestically, that does not have to be reported at any time, ever. Because it's just like the government accumulating more currency domestically. There's no requirements to report governments accumulating domestic currency. So this is why there's this key distinction here, and of course this huge gap between the reporting of increased gold reserves and what's actually happening. of course, China's the world's leading gold producer, and every ounce of that, we assume is just going straight into their own vaults. Russia is one of the world's leading gold producers. We have to assume that virtually every ounce of that gold production is going straight into the Russian government's vault. And Russia is also the most visible buyer of gold among all the world's central banks and sovereign nations.
Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for your time. What an intriguing conversation. I think that this one is going to be one that'll resonate for a long, long time, because we covered all of the most important stuff in a world where it's hard for us to even keep up at SGT Report on a daily basis with how fast news is breaking. Jeff, can you remind people of your website and how they can find your great writing?
Sure. My site is bullionbullscanada.com, and that's where I publish both my commentaries, and we also have a very active community there.
All right, and our friend Andy Miles Franklin, a trusted longtime sponsor of SGT Report, which we appreciate. Andy, why don't you tell people where we can find you and how to make a purchase?
Sure, milesfranklin.com, 800-822-8080, or email me at ahoffman@milesfranklin.com.
Well, I very much appreciate it, guys. Rory and Peter, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And I guess that's it. Folks, thanks for joining us today. And for Real News 24/7, please visit us over at sgtreport.com, where we try to move heaven and earth to bring you real news, reality versus lies. Guys, thanks so much. We'll talk to you again soon.
Lots of fun.
Thanks.
All right, fellas.
Yeah, take care, guys.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.